Paris, early spring, 1988. A man in a gray overcoat crosses Rue de Rivoli just after dawn, briefcase in one hand, folded newspaper in the other. He walks like someone who belongs here, unhurried, blending into the morning commute. But 3 blocks behind him, a woman with auburn hair adjusts her pace to match his. She carries nothing. She speaks into no radio. She simply walks, keeping the gray overcoat in sight while appearing to ignore it entirely. This is mobile surveillance at its most refined, a technique the French call filature, and the Israelis have perfected into an art form. The target's name is Fadel al-Shara, though few people outside Palestinian armed circles know it. He is a senior coordinator for Fatah's military operations in Europe, the man who moves weapons, arranges safe houses, and finances attacks that have killed civilians from Athens to Rome. He believes Paris is neutral ground, that the French will not touch him as long as he keeps operations discreet. He is wrong about the neutrality, and he has no idea he has been under watch for 11 weeks. The woman trailing him is not alone. 4 other operatives bracket the target in overlapping zones, rotating positions every 6 minutes to prevent pattern recognition. They use no earpieces, no hand signals. Each carries a folded city map marking predetermined fallback points. If al-Shara stops unexpectedly, they dissolve into cafes and metro stations. If he runs, 2 will follow while 3 seal exits. But the surveillance is not the operation. It is preparation for what comes next. The question is not whether Mossad can reach him. The question is whether they can do it without leaving evidence that forces the French government to respond, and whether the cost of killing one man is worth the diplomatic firestorm that will follow when his body is found. If you want to see how intelligence agencies operate in cities where they're not supposed to exist, hit subscribe. You're about to see every rule bent and one of them broken. Now rewind. Fadel al-Shara was not a household name, and that was precisely what made him dangerous. While Yasser Arafat appeared on television and Abu Nidal made headlines with airport massacres, al-Shara worked in the operational shadows, managing the logistics that turned ideology into violence. He had been linked by Western intelligence to at least 7 attacks across Europe between 1983 and 1987, including a cafe bombing in West Berlin that killed 2 American soldiers, and a grenade attack on a synagogue in Vienna. His role was never direct. He did not build bombs or pull triggers. He arranged meetings, transferred funds through intermediaries, and identified soft targets for others to strike. This made him legally untouchable under most European laws, which required proof of direct participation for prosecution. Israeli intelligence had been building a file on al-Shara since 1984, when signals intercepts placed him in Rome 3 days before a Fatah cell attempted to hijack an El Al flight. The operation failed, but forensic analysis of weapons recovered at the scene traced them to a shipment al-Shara had personally coordinated through Marseille. By 1986, Mossad had confirmed he was operating primarily from Paris, using a diplomatic passport issued by an Arab state sympathetic to the PLO, and maintaining an apartment in the 16th arrondissement under a cover identity as a cultural attaché. The decision to target him was not made lightly. France in the late 1980s maintained a complex relationship with Palestinian factions, tolerating their presence as long as operations did not threaten French interests directly. The French intelligence service, DGSE, had brokered informal agreements with several PLO-affiliated groups, offering sanctuary in exchange for actionable intelligence on other Middle Eastern players. Killing a Palestinian official on French soil would violate this arrangement, provoke public condemnation from Paris, and risk exposure of Israeli intelligence networks across Europe. But the Israeli cabinet, under Prime Minister Yitzhak Shamir, concluded that al-Shara's operational value to Fatah outweighed diplomatic consequences. He was facilitating attacks that could not be stopped through legal channels, and he was doing it from a city where he felt immune. The message needed to be clear. There was no sanctuary, no neutral ground, no place beyond reach. The operation received authorization in December 1987. The timeline was tight. Al-Shara was scheduled to return to Tunis, where PLO leadership had relocated after being expelled from Beirut in late April. If Mossad was going to act, it had to be before he left European soil. Once back in North Africa, he would be surrounded by security and far harder to isolate. Building the operational picture required patience that field operatives found excruciating. Al-Shara was careful, rotating apartments every few weeks, using public transportation to break surveillance, and avoiding patterns that might make him predictable. Mossad could not simply follow him home and wait for an opening. They needed to understand his entire network, identify who he met, where he felt safest, and when he was most vulnerable. The initial intelligence came from signals intercepts. Israeli listening posts in Cyprus had been monitoring PLO communications for years, tracking coded messages that referenced European cities and operational timelines. One intercept in January 1988 mentioned a Paris coordinator meeting with the engineer in March. Cross-referencing with human intelligence from assets in Tunis confirmed the coordinator was Al-Shara, and the engineer was a bomb maker responsible for devices used in 3 prior attacks. The meeting location was not specified, but the intercept provided a window, sometime in the first 2 weeks of March. Mossad deployed a surveillance team to Paris in mid-January. The unit consisted of 8 operatives, a mix of men and women in their late 20s to early 40s, all carrying legitimate European passports acquired through long-term identity cultivation. They posed as tourists, business travelers, and expatriates. None had diplomatic cover, which meant if caught, Israel would deny their existence. Their first task was locating Al-Shara's current residence. The apartment in the 16th was no longer in use. He had moved after a French counter-surveillance sweep in late '87 detected unusual activity near his building. The team began with known associates, shadowing minor PLO figures who might lead them to the target. It took 3 weeks of monotonous work, sitting in parked cars, loitering in cafes, photographing every face that entered suspected safe houses. The breakthrough came when a low-level courier was observed entering a building in the 11th arrondissement, staying 20 minutes, then leaving with a different coat than he had worn arriving. Clothing switches were tradecraft basics, signals that something worth concealing had occurred inside. Surveillance confirmed Al-Shara was using an apartment on the building's 3rd floor, registered under a false name to a Cypriot import company that existed only on paper. The location presented immediate problems. The building had a single entrance, monitored by a concierge who kept irregular hours. The street was narrow, limiting angles for observation without appearing conspicuous, and Al-Shara never established a predictable schedule. Some days he left at dawn, others he remained inside until evening. He used taxis, buses, and the metro interchangeably, sometimes switching mid-route to flush surveillance. He met contacts in crowded public spaces where recording conversations was nearly impossible. He carried no briefcase or bag that could be tampered with, keeping documents and money on his person. The second constraint was operational security. Mossad knew French intelligence was watching them. DGSE had identified several Israeli operatives in Paris during previous operations and maintained files on suspected Mossad personnel across Europe. Any action that appeared overtly Israeli, any technique too precise or signature method associated with prior assassinations, would trigger immediate investigation. The team could not use the same tradecraft that had worked in Rome or Athens. They needed an approach that looked like someone else's work, or better yet, looked like ordinary crime. The third constraint was time. The intercept mentioning the March meeting suggested Al-Shara was preparing something significant. If Mossad waited too long, whatever he was coordinating might proceed regardless of his elimination. But moving too quickly, without complete intelligence, risked failure. A botched attempt would alert not just Al-Shara, but every Palestinian operative in Europe that Mossad was actively hunting them in Western capitals. The margin for error was non-existent. The operational plan went through 4 iterations before receiving final approval. The first version called for a car bomb, placed under Al-Shara's vehicle during overnight hours. This was rejected because Al-Shara did not own a car and used taxis unpredictably. The second version proposed poisoning, using a slow-acting agent that would cause apparent heart failure days after administration. This was rejected because delivering the poison required direct access, either through food or physical contact, neither of which surveillance teams could reliably engineer. The third version suggested a sniper shot from a concealed position, timed for a moment when Al-Shara was isolated on a predictable route. This was rejected because no such route existed. He never walked the same path twice. The final plan was built around a concept Israeli planners called forced isolation. Rather than waiting for al-Shara to become vulnerable, the team would create circumstances forcing him into a situation where he could be targeted with minimal exposure. The method required manipulating his behavior without his awareness, using his own operational security habits against him. The key insight came from studying al-Shara's meeting patterns. He preferred cafes and public squares for initial contacts, but sensitive exchanges always occurred elsewhere, usually in parked cars or while walking through parks where electronic surveillance was difficult. The team identified one specific behavior. When arranging a meeting involving money or documents, al-Shara would arrive early, observe the location from a distance to ensure no surveillance, then approach only when satisfied the area was secure. This caution could be exploited. If he believed a meeting site was compromised, he would abort and relocate to a backup location. And if the backup location was one Mossad controlled, he would walk directly into the trap. The plan required a diversion operation, something that would appear to al-Shara as a security breach, forcing him to change plans. Mossad decided to stage a fake police action near his primary meeting site, creating enough visible law enforcement presence that any cautious operative would assume the location was compromised. Al-Shara would then use his backup protocol, which surveillance had already identified, a quiet side street near Parc Monceau, used once before when a prior meeting had to be relocated. The execution team would consist of two operatives. The first, a man in his 30s with a forgettable face, would pose as a maintenance worker near the backup site, carrying tools and appearing occupied with routine work. The second, a woman in her late 20s, would approach al-Shara as he arrived, posing as a lost tourist, asking for directions. This would bring her within arm's reach under a pretext he would not perceive as threatening. At the moment of closest approach, she would fire twice with a small caliber pistol fitted with a suppressor, then walk away at a normal pace while the maintenance worker created chaos by triggering a small smoke device that would obscure the scene and delay witnesses from processing what they had seen. The weapon was critical. It had to be reliable, concealable, and untraceable. Mossad used a Beretta pistol, modified in Tel Aviv, with a barrel that would be removed and discarded immediately after use, making ballistics matching impossible. The suppressor was improvised from commercially available parts, purchased in 3 different countries, assembled on site, and designed to be disposable. No serial numbers, no forensic links, nothing that could trace back to Israel. The escape plan relied on speed and simplicity. Both operatives would leave the area separately on foot, blending into pedestrian traffic. Within 10 minutes, they would reach predetermined metro stations, board trains going opposite directions, and transfer multiple times before reaching safe houses on opposite sides of the city. By the time French police established a perimeter, both would be off the street. Their false identities would be abandoned within hours, passports destroyed, and new documents used to exit France through Belgium within 48 hours. The decision point that consumed the most debate was timing. Strike too early, before the March meeting, and Mossad would eliminate al-Shara, but lose the chance to identify who he was meeting and what operation was being planned. Strike too late, after the meeting, and risk the operation proceeding, even with al-Shara dead. The compromise was to strike immediately after the meeting concluded, when al-Shara would be alone, but intelligence would have already observed and identified his contact. This required near-perfect coordination, surveillance teams tracking both al-Shara and his contact, execution team positioned at the backup site, diversion team ready to trigger the fake police action, and exfiltration assets standing by for immediate extraction. One variable remained uncontrolled: French intelligence. If DGSE was also watching al-Shara, if they had operatives near the meeting site, the entire operation could collapse. Mossad had no reliable way to determine French surveillance posture without revealing their own presence. The decision was made to proceed despite the risk. The operation was scheduled for March 14, 1988. Al-Shara had 9 days to live, and he had no idea the clock had started. March 6, 1988. The diversion team arrived in Paris, carrying nothing that would attract attention at customs. No weapons, no communications equipment, no documents linking them to intelligence work. They traveled on Canadian and Belgian passports, booked into modest hotels in different arrondissements, and spent their first 2 days behaving exactly like tourists. They visited museums, ate at cafes, took photographs of the Eiffel Tower. Airport security cameras would show nothing suspicious. Hotel staff would remember nothing unusual. If questioned later, witnesses would describe polite foreigners who paid cash and kept to themselves. Their actual task was acquiring materials for the diversion. French police vehicles could not be stolen without triggering immediate alerts, but they could be simulated with enough accuracy to pass casual observation. One operative purchased magnetic door decals from a printing shop in the 10th arrondissement, paying extra for rush service and providing artwork that approximated Police Nationale markings. The decals would not survive close inspection, but they only needed to work from 50 meters for 90 seconds. A second operative rented 2 Peugeot sedans from different agencies using separate credit cards, both registered to shell companies established months earlier. The sedans were dark blue, close enough to police colors to be convincing in poor light or at a distance. The fake police action required precise choreography. On the morning of March 14th, 2 operatives would park the modified sedans near Café Flore in Saint-Germain-des-Prés, the location where surveillance had confirmed al-Shara intended to meet his contact. They would position the vehicles with emergency flashers activated, creating the appearance of a law enforcement presence. A third operative, wearing a dark jacket that could pass for police attire from a distance, would stand near the cafe entrance holding a radio and appearing to direct an operation. The entire setup would take less than 3 minutes to deploy and could be dismantled in under 1 minute if complications arose. The goal was not to fool actual police, but to create enough ambiguity that al-Shara, observing from his usual vantage point 2 blocks away, would conclude the meeting site was compromised. He would not wait to confirm details. He would abort, contact his associate through a backup communication method, and relocate to the predetermined alternate site. Mossad was betting his operational security training would override curiosity, that he would follow protocol rather than investigate. While the diversion team prepared, surveillance continued without interruption. The 8-person team had settled into rotations that minimized fatigue while maintaining continuous coverage. They had learned al-Shara's rhythms, the small tells that indicated his intentions. When he wore a dark suit, he was meeting contacts. When he dressed casually, he was running errands or moving between safe houses. When he carried a leather portfolio instead of his usual briefcase, the meeting involved documents. These observations were logged in handwritten notes using personal shorthand, nothing that could be decoded if intercepted. Each evening, the team leader compiled reports and transmitted them to Tel Aviv using a burst transmission system that compressed encrypted data into millisecond radio pulses, virtually impossible to detect or trace. Tel Aviv's response on March 9th changed the operation's calculus. Signals intelligence had intercepted another communication, this one between Tunis and Paris, confirming the March 14th meeting, but adding a detail that elevated the stakes. The engineer, al-Shara, had recently acquired timer components from East Germany, sophisticated mechanisms used in delayed detonation devices. The implication was clear. Al-Shara was not merely coordinating logistics for a past operation. He was enabling an attack that had not yet occurred, something significant enough to require specialized components unavailable through normal channels. The operational order from headquarters was unambiguous. The meeting must be observed and documented. The engineer must be identified and tracked. But al-Shara must not leave Paris alive. If the operation had been complex before, it now became brutally difficult. Mossad needed to surveil 2 targets simultaneously, execute an assassination in a controlled environment, and track a secondary target who would certainly disappear the moment he learned his contact was dead. The margin for error, already thin, had essentially vanished. The execution team arrived on March 11th. 2 operatives, selected specifically for this operation, traveling separately, carrying separate legends. The woman, using the name Claire Rousseau on a French passport, had been living her cover identity for 3 years. She worked as a translator in Brussels, a job providing legitimate reason to travel frequently across Europe. Her apartment in Brussels was real, her employment history verifiable, her tax records current. If French police investigated after the operation, they would find a complete life that led nowhere. She had brown hair cut to shoulder length, wore glasses with non-prescription lenses, and dressed in the unremarkable style of a professional woman who wanted to blend into crowds. She was 31 years old and had killed 4 people in operations across 3 countries. The man, traveling as Henrik Vandenberg on a Dutch passport, posed as an electrical contractor. He carried a work van rented in Amsterdam, filled with legitimate tools and equipment that would pass any inspection. His cover was simpler than hers, but equally solid. A small business owner traveling to Paris for a contract job that did not actually exist, but could not be disproven without extensive investigation. He was 36, spoke 4 languages fluently, and had been recruited into Mossad after serving in Sayeret Matkal, the Israeli Special Forces unit that supplied many of the intelligence service's most capable operatives. They met once, briefly, in a parking garage in the 12th arrondissement on the evening of March 12th. The meeting lasted 7 minutes. No written materials exchanged hands. They reviewed the plan verbally, confirmed timing, and discussed contingencies. If the diversion failed and al-Shara did not relocate to the backup site, the operation would abort and reschedule. If French police appeared during execution, both would immediately separate and proceed to emergency exfiltration points. If either was captured, the other would not attempt rescue. These were standard protocols, but repeating them served a psychological function, eliminating doubt, reinforcing commitment, ensuring both understood the consequences of failure. The weapon was transferred during this meeting. Claire received a small nylon pouch containing the modified Beretta, suppressor components, and a single magazine loaded with 8 rounds. The pistol had been smuggled into France 3 weeks earlier inside a diplomatic pouch that French customs did not inspect, then stored in a safe house until needed. She field-stripped the weapon in the parking garage, checked the action, reassembled it, and loaded the magazine. The suppressor would be attached immediately before use. The entire assembly weighed less than 1 kilogram and fit inside a canvas shoulder bag designed for tourists carrying cameras and guidebooks. Henrik received a separate package containing the smoke device, a commercial marine distress signal modified to produce dense white smoke for approximately 45 seconds. It was not illegal to possess, but it was unusual enough that carrying it without justification would raise questions. He placed it inside a toolbox in his van, surrounded by electrical components and wire, where it appeared to be just another piece of equipment. March 13th passed with agonizing slowness. Surveillance teams confirmed al-Shara was preparing for the meeting. He made 2 phone calls from public booths, both brief, both using coded language that suggested final coordination. He visited a currency exchange and withdrew French francs, more cash than he typically carried, indicating he expected to make a payment or receive documents requiring immediate compensation. He returned to his apartment at 1900 hours and remained inside for the night. Surveillance maintained watch from a parked vehicle across the street, rotating observers every 2 hours to prevent fatigue. Lights in al-Shara's apartment went dark at 23:30. He was resting before the meeting. Everything suggested he suspected nothing. The execution team spent that night in separate locations, both awake, both running through mental rehearsals of the next day's actions. Claire sat in her hotel room, reviewing a tourist map of Paris, tracing the route she would walk after the shooting. She had memorized every turn, every metro entrance, every cafe where she could pause if pursuit seemed close. She laid out the clothing she would wear: jeans, a beige jacket, running shoes that looked casual but would allow rapid movement if necessary. She checked the Beretta one final time, then placed it in the shoulder bag and forced herself to sleep for 4 hours. Henrik remained in his van, parked in a public lot near Parc Monceau. He had positioned the vehicle the previous afternoon, paying for 3 days in advance, ensuring it would not attract attention. He tested the smoke device, confirming the ignition mechanism functioned properly, then repacked it carefully. He reviewed his escape route, a series of turns through residential streets that would take him to the Périphérique, the ring road surrounding Paris, where he could merge into traffic and disappear. He did not sleep. He had learned years earlier that he functioned better on adrenaline than rest. March 14th began overcast, temperature in the low 50s, light rain forecast for late afternoon. Weather that would keep crowds thin but not absent. Ideal conditions for an operation requiring witnesses to be present but not numerous. Al-Shara left his apartment at 08:15, earlier than usual, confirming the meeting was scheduled for morning. He wore a dark suit and carried the leather portfolio. Surveillance picked him up immediately, 3 operatives forming a loose perimeter as he walked toward the metro station at République. He took the metro to Saint-Germain-des-Prés, exited the station at 08:43, and began his standard counter-surveillance routine. He walked 2 blocks north, stopped at a kiosk to purchase a newspaper, doubled back south, then entered a cafe and ordered coffee he barely touched. He was watching the street, checking for familiar faces, looking for vehicles that appeared more than once. The surveillance team adapted in real time, rotating positions, using reflections in shop windows to maintain visual contact without direct line of sight. After 20 minutes, apparently satisfied he was not being followed, Al-Shara left the cafe and walked toward the meeting site. He stopped 2 blocks from cafe floor, positioning himself in a doorway with a clear view of the cafe entrance. This was his pattern. Observe from a distance, wait for the contact to arrive first, ensure no police or surveillance presence before committing to the meeting. He checked his watch. 09:10. The meeting was scheduled for 09:30. At 09:15, the diversion team activated. 2 Peugeot sedans with magnetic police decals rolled to a stop in front of cafe floor, emergency flashers pulsing. An operative in a dark jacket stepped out, held a radio to his mouth, and began gesturing toward the cafe entrance. A small crowd of pedestrians slowed to watch, curious about what appeared to be a police operation in progress. The scene looked authentic enough to pass a casual glance. Official vehicles, a figure in quasi-uniform, the choreographed movements suggesting coordinated action. From his doorway 2 blocks away, Al-Shara saw the flashers, saw the figure with the radio, and immediately turned and walked in the opposite direction. No hesitation, no attempt to investigate, just instant recognition that the meeting site was compromised, and protocol demanded immediate withdrawal. He moved quickly but not frantically, the pace of someone who had somewhere to be but was not fleeing. Surveillance confirmed he was heading toward the backup location. At 09:18, the diversion team collapsed. Magnetic decals were peeled off and discarded in a trash bin. The operative with the radio removed his jacket, reversed it to show a different color lining, and walked away. The 2 sedans separated, driving in opposite directions, merging into morning traffic. Within 3 minutes, no evidence remained that anything unusual had occurred. Cafe floor patrons who had paused to watch returned to their breakfast, the momentary curiosity already fading. Al-Shara reached a public phone booth at 09:22. He made a brief call, less than 30 seconds, then hung up and continued walking. Surveillance reported he was moving directly toward Parc Monceau. The backup protocol had been activated. The engineer would receive the location change and proceed to the alternate meeting site. Everything was unfolding exactly as predicted. Claire was already in position. She had arrived at 08:45, taking a seat on a bench near the park entrance, appearing to read a paperback novel while actually watching the street. The shoulder bag rested beside her, unzipped, the Beretta assembled and ready inside. She wore thin leather gloves, the kind appropriate for cool weather, that would leave no fingerprints. Her heart rate was elevated but controlled. This was her 5th targeted killing. The fear had never disappeared, but she had learned to function through it, to convert anxiety into focus. Henrik was parked 30 meters away, the van positioned to give him a clear view of the street. He appeared to be reviewing paperwork, occasionally glancing at a clipboard, projecting the demeanor of a contractor waiting for a client. The toolbox containing the smoke device rested on the passenger seat, lid open, ready for immediate access. At 09:38, Al-Shara appeared at the end of the street. He walked steadily, portfolio under one arm, checking his surroundings with the practiced awareness of someone who had spent years evading surveillance. He passed within 3 meters of Henrik's van without registering it as anything unusual. He was focused on the park entrance, looking for his contact, expecting the engineer to arrive separately. Claire stood, closed the paperback, and began walking toward him. She held a folded tourist map in one hand, the universal signal of someone lost in an unfamiliar city. She timed her approach to intersect his path naturally, not directly, but at an angle that would bring them together as if by coincidence. "Excusez-moi, monsieur," she said in French with a slight accent, holding up the map. "Pouvez-vous m'aider?" Al-Shara stopped, his instinct to avoid interaction overridden by the apparent innocuousness of a lost tourist asking for directions. He glanced at the map, began to respond, and in that half-second of distraction, Claire's right hand moved into the shoulder bag. The first shot hit him in the chest at contact distance, the suppressor muffling the report to a sound like a heavy book dropping on a table. His eyes widened, not with pain yet, but with the recognition that he had made a catastrophic error. The second shot followed a fraction of a second later, striking 2 centimeters from the first, ensuring cardiac or pulmonary damage that would be immediately fatal. He collapsed backward, the portfolio falling from his hand, papers scattering across the sidewalk. Claire was already walking away, the pistol back in the bag, her pace unchanged. She did not run. Running would attract attention, mark her as fleeing, trigger pursuit. She walked with purpose, but not panic. A woman who had finished her errand and was moving to the next. Behind her, Henrik triggered the smoke device and tossed it into the street. Dense white smoke erupted, filling the immediate area, obscuring visibility, creating chaos that would buy precious seconds before witnesses could organize a coherent description of what they had seen. A woman screamed. A man shouted for someone to call an ambulance. People began converging on the fallen figure, trying to understand what had happened, whether it was a heart attack or something worse. In the confusion, Claire reached the corner, turned left, and disappeared into the flow of pedestrian traffic. Henrik pulled away from the curb, the van merging smoothly into traffic, just another contractor finishing a job and moving to the next site. By 0942, both were off the street. Claire descended into the metro at Villiers Station, boarded a train toward Châtelet, and transferred twice before exiting at Gare de Lyon. Henrik drove the perimeter road to the A4 autoroute, heading east toward Reims, where the van would be abandoned and a train would carry him to Belgium. Neither would learn for several hours whether Al-Shara had died at the scene or survived long enough to provide descriptions to French police. But the shooting had been clinical, the shots placed with precision that left little doubt about the outcome. Al-Shara was pronounced dead at 0956, 14 minutes after the shooting. Paramedics arrived within 6 minutes, but the damage was irreversible. Both rounds had penetrated the left ventricle, causing massive internal hemorrhaging. He lost consciousness within 30 seconds of being shot and never regained it. French police secured the scene, collected the scattered papers from the portfolio, and began interviewing witnesses who provided fragmentary and conflicting descriptions of the shooter. A woman, possibly in her 30s, maybe blonde or light brown hair, wearing a jacket that was either beige or gray. The smoke device had done its work. No one could agree on details with enough precision to generate a useful composite sketch. The engineer, approaching from the opposite direction, saw the police vehicles and the growing crowd around the fallen figure. He did not stop to investigate. He turned and walked away, his instincts warning him that whatever had happened, the meeting was over, and staying in the area was suicide. Mossad surveillance teams tracked him through the streets for 2 hours as he employed counter-surveillance techniques that confirmed professional training. He switched metro lines 4 times, entered a department store through one entrance, and exited through another, and eventually disappeared into a residential building in the 18th arrondissement that served as a safe house for Palestinian operatives. The surveillance team did not follow him inside. Their orders were to identify and locate, not to capture or confront. The address was photographed, cross-referenced against known PLO properties, and transmitted to Tel Aviv. The engineer would be dealt with later, through other means, in another city. For now, the primary objective had been achieved. Fadel al-Shara was dead. The French Interior Ministry received notification of the shooting at 1000 hours, 43 minutes after al-Shara's death. Initial reports described it as a possible robbery gone wrong, a foreign national killed in a tourist area under circumstances suggesting random street crime. This assessment lasted approximately 2 hours, until investigators identified the victim through documents in his portfolio and cross-referenced his name against intelligence databases. What had appeared to be ordinary violence became something far more complicated. Al-Shara's diplomatic passport, issued by Algeria, granted him theoretical protection under international law. His status as a cultural attaché, while obviously a cover, provided legal justification for his presence in France. His assassination was not merely murder, but a violation of French sovereignty, an act of foreign violence conducted on French soil without notification or consent. The Interior Ministry immediately escalated the case to the Direction Générale de la Sécurité Extérieure, France's external intelligence service, which had been monitoring al-Shara intermittently for 18 months. DGSE analysts reviewing the case file reached conclusions within hours that would take French police days to confirm. The shooting bore signatures of professional execution: close-range shots to center mass, immediate exfiltration, use of distraction to cover escape. No forensic evidence left at the scene. Witness descriptions were vague and contradictory, suggesting either the shooter was exceptionally unremarkable or something had been done to compromise observation. The smoke device, once investigators identified residue, indicated premeditation and planning beyond the capacity of ordinary criminals. Most significantly, the timing and location suggested the shooter had known al-Shara's movements in advance. He had been killed not at his apartment or a location he visited regularly, but at a secondary meeting site he had used only once before, a location requiring surveillance and intelligence to predict. This was not a crime of opportunity. It was a targeted assassination, executed by professionals who had been tracking him for weeks or months. DGSE briefed the Interior Minister at 1600 hours. The assessment was blunt. This was almost certainly an Israeli operation, consistent with Mossad methods used in previous assassinations across Europe. The use of a female operative matched the killing of Mahmoud Hamshari in 1972. The close-range shooting in a public area matched the assassination of Basil al-Kubaisi in 1973. The rapid exfiltration, without leaving forensic traces, matched a dozen other operations attributed to Israeli intelligence over the past 15 years. The Interior Minister faced a decision with no satisfactory options. France could publicly accuse Israel, demand explanations, expel Israeli diplomats, and strain relations with a country that was simultaneously an ally and a persistent irritant. This would satisfy public demands for accountability, but achieve nothing substantive. Mossad would never acknowledge the operation, Israel would deny involvement, and diplomatic relations would suffer damage without producing justice or deterrence. Alternatively, France could pursue the investigation quietly, avoid public accusations, and address the violation through private diplomatic channels. This would preserve the relationship, but send a message to other intelligence services that France was willing to tolerate assassinations on its soil as long as they were conducted discreetly. The risk was encouraging further operations, transforming Paris into an open hunting ground, where any agency with sufficient capability could eliminate targets without fear of meaningful consequences. The decision, made at the highest levels of French government, split the difference in a way that satisfied no one, but avoided the worst outcomes. France would investigate aggressively, publicize the fact that a foreign national with diplomatic status had been murdered, and make clear that such actions were unacceptable. But France would not formally accuse Israel or take actions that would force the Israeli government into a position requiring public denial or escalation. The message would be delivered privately. This was noticed. This was unacceptable. This cannot happen again without consequences. Israeli ambassador to France received a summons to the Quai d'Orsay, the foreign ministry, on March 16th. The meeting lasted 12 minutes. He was informed that France had concluded the killing of Fidel al-Shara was the work of a foreign intelligence service, that such operations violated French sovereignty and international law, and that France expected assurances no similar incidents would occur in the future. The ambassador, following instructions from Tel Aviv, expressed concern about the killing, noted that Israel had no information about the perpetrators, and assured his hosts that Israel respected French sovereignty and expected all parties to refrain from violence on French soil. Both sides understood the performance. France had registered its objection in a manner allowing Israel to acknowledge the message without admitting responsibility. Israel had received the warning in a manner allowing it to adjust future operations without conceding past actions. The diplomatic ritual had been completed. What happened next would depend on whether either side believed the other's implicit promises. Within Mossad headquarters in Tel Aviv, the operation was assessed as a tactical success with strategic complications. Al-Shara was dead, his contacts disrupted, his planned operation delayed or canceled. The engineer had been identified and located, his safe house now under surveillance by assets who would track his movements and report on his activities. The execution had been clean. Both operatives had exfiltrated without compromise, and no forensic evidence linked the killing to Israel. By operational metrics, the mission had achieved every objective, but the French reaction, while restrained, indicated limits had been tested. Mossad maintained networks across Europe that depended on host governments tolerating a certain level of intelligence activity, as long as it remained deniable and did not threaten domestic stability. Assassinations pushed those boundaries, forcing governments to choose between ignoring violations and confronting a valuable ally. France had chosen a middle path this time, but the warning was clear. Repeated operations would eventually force a harder response. The debate within Israeli intelligence leadership centered on whether the warning should modify future planning. One faction argued that France's restrained reaction proved the current approach worked, that as long as operations were professionally executed and targets were individuals France itself considered security threats, French objections would remain largely performative. Israel should continue operating in Paris as needed, accepting that occasional diplomatic friction was the price of eliminating threats before they materialized into attacks. The opposing faction argued that each operation increased the risk of catastrophic exposure, that eventually Mossad would make a mistake or encounter an operation that forced France into a public confrontation Israel could not afford. Better to shift operations to locations with less scrutiny, target individuals in cities where host governments were weaker or more sympathetic, and preserve Paris as a surveillance and intelligence gathering hub rather than an execution site. The compromise reached was characteristic of intelligence bureaucracies everywhere. No formal policy change, but heightened approval requirements for future operations in France. Assassinations in Paris would require authorization from the Prime Minister's office rather than Mossad leadership alone, ensuring political considerations were weighed alongside operational advantages. In practice, this meant fewer operations but not none, a recalibration rather than a prohibition. The engineer remained in Paris for 6 days after al-Shara's death, apparently waiting for instructions from Tunis about how to proceed. Surveillance teams tracked him to 3 additional meetings, all with known Fatah operatives, all in locations suggesting he was attempting to reconstitute the network al-Shara had managed. On March 20th, he departed Paris by train to Brussels, then flew to Algiers. Mossad did not attempt to stop him. He was now flagged in multiple databases, his photograph distributed to friendly intelligence services, his travel patterns monitored. Killing him immediately after al-Shara would have confirmed the operations were linked and suggested Mossad possessed comprehensive penetration of Fatah communications. Better to let him operate under surveillance, feeding information about Palestinian networks that could be exploited later. The timer components he had acquired were never used in an attack. Intelligence intercepts over the following months suggested the operation al-Shara had been coordinating was abandoned after his death. The remaining participants concluding that Israeli penetration of their network was too comprehensive to risk proceeding. Whether this represented genuine disruption or merely temporary delay was impossible to determine. Operations postponed sometimes reappeared months or years later under different leadership with modified plans. But for the immediate term, whatever al-Shara had been building died with him. Palestinian response to the assassination was muted, at least publicly. Fatah issued a statement condemning the murder of a cultural representative and calling on French authorities to bring the perpetrators to justice. The statement did not mention Mossad or Israel directly, a rhetorical restraint suggesting Fatah leadership understood that publicizing Israeli success would only highlight Palestinian vulnerability. Internally, according to Signal's intelligence, the reaction was more visceral. Communications between Tunis and European cells reflected anger, fear, and demands for improved security protocols. Several operatives requested reassignment out of Western Europe, preferring the relative safety of Arab capitals, where Israeli operations were more difficult to execute. One intercept, decoded 3 weeks after the assassination, captured a conversation between 2 Fatah commanders, discussing what al-Shara's death meant for operations in Europe. The exchange was brief, fragmentary, but revealing. One commander asked whether anyone was truly safe if the Israelis wanted them dead. The other responded that safety was irrelevant, that the struggle continued regardless of personal risk, that martyrdom was always a possibility. But the tone, analyzed by Hebrew University linguists contracted by Israeli intelligence, suggested resignation rather than defiance. The psychological impact of the assassination, the demonstration that Mossad could reach targets even in cities theoretically insulated by European law and diplomacy, had achieved an effect beyond the immediate disruption of one network. French police investigation continued for 6 months, generating thousands of pages of reports and witness interviews that produced no actionable leads. The female shooter was never identified. Witness descriptions were too vague and contradictory to generate a useful composite. Surveillance cameras in the area had been offline for maintenance, a coincidence investigators found suspicious but could not disprove. The Beretta used in the shooting was never recovered. The barrel had been removed and discarded in the Seine within an hour of the assassination. The frame and slide separated and dropped in different trash bins across the city. Forensic examination of the scene produced no fingerprints, no DNA, no trace evidence linking to any known individual. The investigation was formally suspended in September 1988, though not officially closed. It remained in the files as an unsolved homicide, periodically reviewed when new information emerged about Mossad operations in Europe, but never advancing beyond speculation and circumstantial assessment. French investigators knew who had ordered the killing, and likely who had executed it, but knowing and proving were different standards, and the evidence required for prosecution did not exist. For the 2 operatives who carried out the assassination, the operation became another entry in classified personnel files that would remain sealed for decades. Claire returned to Brussels, resumed her cover identity as a translator, and continued living the constructed life that made her invisible. Henrik returned to Amsterdam, closed his contracting business 6 months later as planned, and rotated to a different cover identity in a different city. Both would participate in additional operations over the following years, some successful, some compromised, all justified by the logic that threats to Israeli security required responses that transcended borders and legal constraints. Years later, after the Cold War ended and intelligence agencies began selectively declassifying historical operations, fragments of the al-Shara assassination appeared in academic studies and journalistic investigations of Mossad activities in Europe. But the full details remained classified, protected by Israeli secrecy laws, and the simple fact that confirming an assassination, even decades after the fact, created legal and diplomatic complications no government wanted to address. The operation existed in the uncertain space of widely suspected, but never officially acknowledged events, understood by intelligence professionals and historians, but absent from official records. The engineer tracked after al-Shara's death continued operating for 3 more years, before disappearing from intelligence monitoring in 1991. Whether he was killed in a subsequent operation, arrested by a European security service, or simply went underground deeply enough to evade detection, was never confirmed. His timer components, or devices built from similar designs, appeared in 2 bombings in 1989 and 1990, suggesting the knowledge he possessed had been transferred to others, even if his personal involvement ceased. Disrupting one network, eliminating one facilitator, did not end the threat. It merely forced adaptation, creating temporary advantage that required constant reinforcement to maintain. The assassination of Fadel al-Shara marked a turning point in how Mossad approached operations in Western Europe, though the shift was gradual and never formalized into explicit policy. Before March 1988, Israeli intelligence had operated in European capitals with a confidence bordering on impunity, assuming that professional execution and diplomatic deniability would be sufficient to manage consequences. The French reaction, while restrained, demonstrated that even patient allies had limits, that accumulating violations would eventually force responses Israel could not control. The immediate operational change was geographic. Between 1988 and 1992, Mossad conducted no confirmed assassinations in Paris, a 4-year pause unprecedented in the agency's European operations tempo. Targets who would previously have been eliminated in France were instead tracked to locations with less diplomatic sensitivity. 2 Palestinian operatives linked to Fatah's European network were killed in Cyprus in 1989, under circumstances suggesting professional hits. A logistics coordinator was killed in Athens in 1990. Another was killed in Tunisia in 1991, on the outskirts of the PLO compound, where security was theoretically strongest, but where host government cooperation made Israeli operations easier to execute and conceal. The pattern was clear. Mossad had concluded that Paris, along with other Western European capitals where governments maintain rule of law and independent judiciaries, required more caution than cities where political instability or sympathetic regimes provided operational flexibility. This did not mean Western Europe became off-limits. It meant the calculus shifted. Operations in Paris required higher-value targets, clearer intelligence about imminent threats, and greater confidence that the diplomatic cost would be justified by security benefits achieved. This calculation was tested again in 1992, when Atef Besaso, a senior PLO intelligence official, was shot dead outside his hotel in Paris. The killing bore obvious similarities to al-Shara's assassination: professional execution, immediate exfiltration, no forensic traces. French authorities responded with predictable outrage, summoning the Israeli ambassador, launching investigations that produced no arrests, and privately warning that continued operations would force public confrontation. The warning was again ignored when operational necessity outweighed diplomatic caution. But the gap between operations had widened from months to years, suggesting at least some modification of Israeli behavior. What changed more fundamentally was not whether Mossad operated in Europe, but how those operations were justified internally and externally. The era of purely retributive assassinations, killing individuals because they had participated in past attacks against Israelis, gradually gave way to a more restrictive doctrine focused on disrupting active operations. Al-Shara had been targeted not merely for his history, but for his present coordination of networks that intelligence suggested were planning future attacks. This distinction mattered less in practice than in principle, providing legal and ethical justification that made operations easier to defend when diplomatic consequences arrived. The shift also reflected changing geopolitical realities. The 1990s saw the beginning of the Oslo peace process, negotiations between Israel and the PLO that required treating Palestinian leadership as potential partners rather than permanent enemies. Assassinating Palestinian officials in European capitals complicated diplomacy, making it harder to maintain the fiction that Israel was committed to negotiated settlement while simultaneously eliminating negotiating counterparts. Operations continued, but they increasingly targeted individuals outside mainstream PLO leadership, focusing on Hamas and Islamic Jihad operatives who rejected negotiations and whose elimination would not directly undermine peace efforts. For France, the al-Shara assassination became a case study in the limits of sovereignty when confronting intelligence services that operated beyond traditional constraints. French officials understood they could not prevent Israeli operations through diplomatic warnings alone. Mossad answered to Israeli security imperatives, not French legal norms, and would continue operating as long as the benefits outweighed costs. But France could make those operations more difficult, more risky, more costly, in ways that influenced Israeli calculations without requiring direct confrontation. French counterintelligence increased surveillance of suspected Israeli operatives in Paris throughout the 1990s, not to arrest them, but to make their presence known, to signal that France was watching and would detect patterns if Mossad became careless. DGSE shared information more freely with other European services, building collective awareness that made coordinated operations across multiple countries harder to execute without detection. And French diplomats made clear in private channels that the next assassination in Paris would not be handled quietly, that public accusation and diplomatic consequences would follow if Israel demonstrated it had learned nothing from previous warnings. These measures did not stop Israeli operations, but they shaped them. Mossad adapted by using operatives with no prior exposure to French surveillance, employing deeper cover identities that required years to build, and extending timelines between surveillance and execution to reduce the chance of detection. Operations became more expensive, more time-consuming, more risky. The cost-benefit calculation shifted enough that some proposed operations were canceled or redirected to locations where the operational environment was more permissive. For Palestinian organizations, al-Shara's assassination reinforced lessons learned through decades of Israeli operations. European capitals were not safe havens. Diplomatic credentials provided no real protection. Security protocols could be penetrated by patient surveillance. The operational implication was increasing paranoia that made coordination more difficult, networks more fragmented, and trust more elusive. Palestinian operatives in Europe began operating in smaller cells with limited communication between groups. reducing Israeli ability to map entire networks, but also reducing Palestinian operational effectiveness. This fragmentation was precisely what Israeli planners hoped to achieve. The goal of assassination campaigns was never eliminating every potential threat, which was impossible, but disrupting organizational cohesion to the point where planning sophisticated attacks became prohibitively difficult. Each successful operation forced Palestinian networks to rebuild, to establish new communication channels, to vet personnel more carefully, to operate more cautiously. This friction did not prevent all attacks, but it delayed them, reduced their sophistication, and created opportunities for intelligence services to detect preparations before operations launched. The human cost of this strategy was rarely discussed in official assessments. Al-Shara left behind a wife and 3 children, who were informed of his death through news reports before Palestinian officials could provide notification. They had known his work was dangerous, but had believed European location provided some margin of safety. His death destroyed that illusion, forcing them into life defined by his absence and the unanswered questions about who killed him and why. French authorities could provide no closure, no arrests, no justice. The file remained open but inactive, a bureaucratic acknowledgement that some crimes were solved through investigation, while others remained mysteries protected by state power and classified operations. For the 2 operatives who executed the assassination, the operation became part of personal histories they could never discuss, successes measured only in classified performance reviews and the knowledge that threats had been disrupted. Years later, when one of them left Mossad and attempted to process what had been done in the name of national security, the moral complexity became harder to dismiss. Killing someone was easier when framed as operational necessity, harder when remembered as a human being bleeding on a sidewalk while strangers screamed for help. The justifications that worked in Tel Aviv briefing rooms felt less solid in retrospect, when divorced from the adrenaline of execution and the certainty of being right. But these doubts, if they existed, never appeared in official records. Intelligence services do not document moral ambiguity or operational regret. They document success and failure, costs and benefits, lessons learned for application in future operations. By those metrics, the Al-Shara assassination was unambiguously successful. Target eliminated, network disrupted, operation completed without compromise or capture. That the success created diplomatic complications and forced tactical adjustments in subsequent operations was simply the cost of conducting covert action in an environment where no operation occurred in isolation. The broader question, one that intelligence professionals rarely addressed publicly, was whether assassination campaigns achieved strategic objectives or merely created the illusion of progress while perpetuating cycles of violence that ensured continued conflict. Al-Shara's death disrupted one network, but the conditions that produced him, the ideological commitment and organizational infrastructure supporting armed resistance to Israeli occupation, remained intact. New coordinators emerged to replace him. New engineers acquired timer components. New attacks were planned and sometimes executed. Decades after his death, violence between Israelis and Palestinians continued, suggesting that eliminating individuals, however operationally satisfying, did not resolve the underlying political conflict driving the violence. Israeli officials, when pressed on this question, typically argued that intelligence services were not responsible for solving political conflicts. Their mandate was managing immediate threats, disrupting operations, protecting citizens from attacks that would occur if intelligence services did nothing. Whether assassination campaigns contributed to long-term peace was a question for diplomats and politicians, not operatives tasked with preventing attacks. This division of responsibility was intellectually defensible, but emotionally unsatisfying, creating a permanent disconnect between tactical success and strategic stalemate. Palestinian officials made the mirror argument. Armed resistance was necessary because political processes failed to deliver justice or sovereignty, and casualties inflicted by Israeli operations were martyrs whose deaths justified continued struggle. This logic, equally self-contained and self-justifying, ensured that each side could claim moral clarity while perpetuating violence the other side experienced as terrorism or legitimate defense. The assassination of Fadel al-Shara existed within this larger context, one operation among thousands, conducted over decades by intelligence services on multiple sides, pursuing incompatible objectives. It was professionally executed, strategically justified, and ultimately insufficient. The network he built was disrupted but not destroyed. The threat he represented was delayed but not eliminated. And the cycle of violence that produced him continued long after his death, ensuring that other operatives would be recruited, other networks would be built, and other assassinations would be planned in the perpetual present tense of unresolved conflict. What remains, years after files were partially declassified and operations became historical case studies rather than active secrets, is a question that intelligence agencies answer through action rather than analysis. When does eliminating one person prevent enough harm to justify the risks, the diplomatic costs, the moral complexity of state-sanctioned killing? When does disruption become perpetuation? When does tactical success mask strategic failure? When does security imperatives override the constraints that separate intelligence operations from murder? The operatives who killed Fadel al-Shara believed they had an answer. The French officials who investigated his death had a different answer. The Palestinian networks that rebuilt after his elimination had yet another. And the civilians who died in attacks that might have been prevented, or that occurred because of blowback from operations like his assassination, never had the chance to answer at all. The operation succeeded by every metric Israeli planners used to evaluate it. Whether it should have been conducted at all is a question that remains unresolved, buried in classified files that will remain sealed for decades, protected by secrecy laws designed to prevent accountability for actions taken in the name of national security. The only certainty is that similar operations continued, similar debates occurred, and similar questions went unanswered, as intelligence services across the world balanced effectiveness against consequences in cities where sovereignty was theoretical and power determined what rules applied. In the specific calculus of disruption versus blowback, the elimination of a logistics coordinator who facilitated attacks reduced immediate capability, while potentially accelerating long-term adaptation. FATA networks in Europe became more careful, more compartmented, harder to penetrate, but also less effective at coordinating complex operations. Whether this made Israelis safer in any meaningful sense depended on whether you measured safety in attacks prevented this year or resilience built for the next decade. Does eliminating a logistics coordinator actually prevent attacks long-term, or does it just force networks to adapt in ways that make them harder to stop next time? Is temporary disruption worth the diplomatic cost when the underlying conflict remains unresolved? What would you do differently if you were running the operation? Drop your thoughts in the comments, and if you want to see how other intelligence services operate when no one's watching, hit that subscribe button.